Chapter 16 of The Last Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Last Trail by Zane Grey, Chapter 16. The longest day in Jonathan Zane's life, the oddest, the most terrible and complex with unintelligible emotions, was that one in which he learned that the wilderness no longer sufficed for him. He wandered through the forest like a man lost, searching for he knew not what. Rambling along the shady trails, he looked for that contentment which had always been his, but found it not. He plunged into the depth of deep, gloomy ravines, into the fastness of heavy-timbered hollows where the trees hid the light of day. He sought the open grassy hillsides, and roamed far over meadow and plain. Yet something always eluded him. The invisible and beautiful life of all inanimate things sang no more to his heart. The springy moss, the quavering leaf, the telltale bark of the trees, the limpid, misty, eddying pools under green banks, the myriads of natural objects from which he had learned so much, and the manifold joyous life around him, no longer spoke with soul-satisfying faithfulness. The environment of his boyish days, of his youth and manhood, rendered not a sweetness as of old. His intelligence, sharpened by the pain of new experience, told him he had been vain to imagine that he, because he was a borderman, could escape the universal destiny of human life. Dimly he could feel the broadening, the awakening into a fuller existence. But he did not welcome this new light. He realized that men had always turned at some time in their lives to women, even as the cypress leans toward the sun. This weakening of the sterner stuff in him, this softening of his heart, and especially the inquietude and lack of joy and harmony in his old pursuits of the forest trails bewildered him and troubled him some. Thousands of times his borderman trail had been crossed, yet never to his sorrow until now, when it had been crossed by a woman. Sick at heart, hurt in his pride, darkly savage, sad, remorseful, and thrilling with awakened passion, all in turn, he roamed the woodland unconsciously, visiting the scenes where he had formerly found contentment. He paused by many a shady glen and beautiful quiet glade, by gray cliffs and mossy banks, searching with moody eyes for the spirit which evaded him. Here in the green and golden woods rose before him a rugged giant rock, moss-stained and gleaming with trickling water. Tangled ferns, dressed in autumn's russet hue, lay at the base of the green-gray cliff, and circled a dark, deep pool, dotted with yellow leaves. Halfway up, the perpendicular ascent was broken by a protruding ledge, upon which waved broad-leaved plants and rusty ferns. Above, the cliff sheered out with many cracks and seams in its weather-beaten front. The forest grew to the verge of the precipice. A full-foliaged oak and a luxuriant maple, the former still fresh with its dark green leaves, the latter making a vivid contrast with its pale yellow, purple, red, and orange hues, leaned far out over the bluff. A mighty chestnut grasped with gnarled roots deep into the broken cliff. Dainty plumes of goldenrod swayed on the brink. Red berries, amber moss, and green trailing vines peeped over the edge, and every little niche and cranny sported fragile ferns and pale-faced asters. A second cliff, higher than the first, and more heavily wooded, loomed above, and over it sprayed a transparent film of water, thin as smoke, and iridescent in the sunshine. Far above, where the glancing rill caressed the mossy cliff, and shone like gleaming gold against the dark branches with their green and red-purple leaves, lay the faint blue of the sky. Jonathan pulled on down the stream with humbler heart. His favorite waterfall had denied him. The gold that had gleamed there was his sweetheart's hair, the red was her lips, the dark pool with its light and shades, its unfathomable mystery, was like her eyes. He came at length to another scene of milder aspect, an open glade, where the dancing, dimpling brook raced under dark hemlocks, and where blood-red sumac leaves and beech leaves like flashes of sunshine lay against the green. Under a leaning birch he found a patch of purple asters, and a little apart from them, by a mossy stone, a lonely fringed gentian. Its deep color brought him the dark blue eyes that haunted him, and once again, like one possessed of an evil spirit, he wandered along the merry watercourse. But finally pain and unrest left him. When he surrendered to his love, peace returned. Though he said in his heart that Helen was not for him, he felt he did not need to torture himself by fighting against resistless power. He could love her without being a coward. He would take up his life where it had been changed, and live it, carrying this bittersweet burden always. Memory, now that he admitted himself conquered, made a toy of him, bringing the sweetness of fragrant hair and eloquent eyes and clinging arms and dewy lips. 1,000-fold harder to fight than pain was the seductive thought that he had but to go back to Helen, to feel again the charm of her presence, to see the grace of her person, to hear the music of her voice, to have again her lips on his. Jonathan knew then that his trial had but begun, that the pain and suffering of a borderman's broken pride and conquered spirit was nothing, that to steel his heart against the joy, the sweetness, the longing of love was everything. So a tumult raged within his heart. No bitterness nor wretchedness stabbed him as before, but a passionate yearning, born of memory, and unquenchable as the fires of the sun, burned there. Helen's reply to his pale excuses, to his duty, to his life, was that she loved him. The wonder of it made him weak. Was not her answer enough? I love you. 3 words only, but they changed the world. A beautiful girl loved him. She had kissed him, and his life could never again be the same. She had held out her arms to him, and he, cold, churlish, unfeeling brute, had let her shame herself, fighting for her happiness, for the joy that is a woman's divine right. He had been blind. He had not understood the significance of her gracious action. He had never realized until too late what it must have cost her, what heart-breaking shame and scorn his refusal brought upon her. If she ever looked tenderly at him again with those great eyes, or leaned toward him with her beautiful arms outstretched, he would fall at her feet and throw his duty to the winds, swearing his love was hers always, and his life forever. So love stormed in the borderman's heart. Slowly the melancholy Indian summer day waned as Jonathan strode out of the woods into a plain beyond, where he was to meet Wetzel at sunset. A smoky haze, like a purple cloud, lay upon the gently waving grass. He could not see across the stretch of prairie land, though at this point he knew it was hardly a mile wide. With the trilling of the grasshoppers alone disturbing the serene quiet of this autumn afternoon, all nature seemed in harmony with the declining season. He stood a while, his thoughts becoming the calmer for the silence and loneliness of this breathing meadow. When the shadows of the trees began to lengthen and to steal far out over the yellow grass, he knew the time had come, and glided out upon the plain. He crossed it, and sat down upon a huge stone which lay with one shelving end overhanging the river. Far to the west the gold-red sun, too fiery for his direct gaze, lost the brilliance of its under circle behind the fringe of the wooded hill. Slowly the red ball sank. When the last bright gleam had vanished in the dark horizon, Jonathan turned to search the wood and plain. Wetzel was to meet him at sunset. Even as his first glance swept around, a light step sounded behind him. He did not move, for that step was familiar. In another moment the tall form of Wetzel stood beside him. "I'm about as much behind as you was ahead of time," said Wetzel. "We'll stay here for the night, and be off early in the morning." Under the shelving side of the rock, and in the shade of the thicket, The bordermen built a little fire and roasted strips of deer meat. Then, puffing at their long pipes, they sat for a long time in silence, while twilight let fall a dark, gray cloak over river and plain. "Legget's move up the river was a blind, as I suspected," he said Wetzel presently. "He's not far back in the woods from here, and seems to be waitin' for somethin' or somebody. Brandt and 7 redskins are with him. We'd have a good chance at them in the mornin'. Now we've got 'em a long ways from their camp, so we'll wait and see what deviltry they're up to." "Maybe he's waitin' for some Injun band," suggested Jonathan. "Thar's redskins in the valley and close to him, but I reckon he's barkin' up another tree." "Suppose we run into some of these Injuns?" "I'll have to take what comes," replied Wetzel, lying down on a bed of leaves. When darkness enveloped the spot, Wetzel lay wrapped in deep slumber, while Jonathan sat against the rock, watching the last flickerings of the camp fire. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Last Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Last Trail by Zane Grey. Chapter 17. Will and Helen hurried along the river road. Beguiled by the soft beauty of the autumn morning, they ventured further from the fort than ever before, and had been suddenly brought to a realization of the fact by a crackling in the underbrush. Instantly their minds reverted to bears and panthers, such as they had heard invested the thickets round the settlement. "Oh, Will, I saw a dark form stealing along the woods from tree to tree," exclaimed Helen in a startled whisper. "So did I. It was an Indian, or I never saw one. Walk faster. Once we round the bend in the road, we'll be within sight of the fort. Then we'll run," replied Will. He had turned pale, but maintained his composure. They increased their speed, and almost had come up to the curve in the road, marked by dense undergrowth on both sides, when the branches in the thicket swayed violently. A sturdy little man, armed with a musket, appeared from among them. "Avast, heave ho!" he commanded in a low, fierce voice, leveling his weapon. "One breeze from ye, and I'll let sail this broadside." "What do you want? We have no valuables," said Will, speaking low. Helen stared at the little man. She was speechless with terror. It flashed into her mind as soon as she recognized the red, evil face of the sailor, that he was the accomplice upon whom Brandt had told Metzer he could rely. "Shut up. It's not ye I want, nor valuables, but this wench," growled Case. He pushed Will around with the muzzle of the musket, which action caused the young man to turn a sickly white and shrink involuntarily with fear. The hammer of the musket was raised and might fall at the slightest jar. "For God's sake, Will, do as he says," cried Helen, who saw murder in Case's eyes. Capture or anything was better than sacrifice of life. "March!" ordered Case, with the musket against Will's back. Will hurriedly started forward, jostling Helen, who had preceded him. He was forced to hurry because every few moments Case pressed the gun to his back or side. Without another word the sailor marched them swiftly along the road, which now narrowed down to a trail. His intention, no doubt, was to put as much distance between him and the fort as was possible. No more than a mile had been thus traversed when 2 Indians stepped into view. "My God! My God!" cried Will, as the savages proceeded first to bind Helen's arms behind her, and then his in the same manner. After this the journey was continued in silence, the Indians walking beside the prisoners and Case in the rear. Helen was so terrified that for a long time she could not think coherently. It seemed as if she had walked miles, yet did not feel tired. Always in front wound the narrow, leaf-girded trail, and to the left the broad river gleamed at intervals through open spaces. In the thickets flocks of birds rose in the line of march. They seemed tame, and uttered plaintive notes as if in sympathy. About noon the trail led to the river bank, One of the savages disappeared in a copse of willows, and presently reappeared carrying a birch-bark canoe. Case ordered Helen and Will into the boat, got in himself and the savages, taking stations at bow and stern, paddled out into the stream. They shot over under the lee of an island, around a rocky point, and across a strait to another island. Beyond this they gained the Ohio shore, and beached the canoe. "Ahoy there, cap'n!" cried Case, pushing Helen up the bank before him, and she, gazing upward, was more than amazed to see Mordaunt leaning against a tree. "Mordaunt, had you anything to do with this?" cried Helen breathlessly. "I had all to do with it," answered the Englishman. "What do you mean?" He did not meet her gaze nor make reply, but turned to address a few words in a low tone to a white man sitting on a log. Helen knew she had seen this person before, and doubted not he was one of Metzar's men. She saw a rude bark lean-to, the remains of campfires, and a pack tied in blankets. Evidently Mordaunt and his men had tarried here awaiting such developments as had come to pass. "You white-faced hound!" hissed Will, beside himself with rage when he realized the situation. Bound as he was, he leaped up and tried to get at Mordaunt. Case knocked him on the head with the handle of his knife. Will fell with blood streaming from a cut over the temple. The dastardly act aroused all Helen's fiery courage. She turned to the Englishman with eyes ablaze. "So you've at last found your level, border outlaw. Kill me at once. I'd rather be dead than breathe the same air with such a coward." "I swore I'd have you, if not by fair means, then by foul," he answered, with dark and haggard face. "What do you intend to do with me now that I'm tied?" she demanded scornfully. "Keep you a prisoner in the woods till you consent to marry me?" Helen laughed in scorn. Desperate as was her plight, her natural courage had arisen at that cruel blow dealt her cousin, and she faced the Englishman with flashing eyes and undaunted mien. She saw he was again unsteady, and had the cough and catching breath habitual to certain men under the influence of liquor. She turned her attention to Will. He lay as he had fallen, with blood streaming over his pale face and fair hair. While she gazed at him, Case whipped out his long knife and looked up at Mordaunt. "Captain, we'd better loosen a hatch for him," he said brutally. "He's dead cargo for us and in the way." He lowered the gleaming point upon Will's chest. "Oh!" breathed Helen in horror. She tried to close her eyes, but was so fascinated she could not. "Get up. I'll have no murder," ordered Mordaunt. "Leave him here." "He's not bad cut," said the man sitting on a log. "He'll come to after a spell. Go back to the fort and give an alarm." "What's that to me?" asked Mordaunt sharply. "We shall be safe. I won't have him with us because some Indian or another will kill him. It's not my purpose to murder anyone." "Ugh!" grunted one of the savages, and pointed eastward with his hand. "Hurry, long way go," he said in English. With the Indians in the lead, the party turned from the river into the forest. Helen looked back into the sandy glade and saw Will lying as they had left him, unconscious, with his hands still bound tightly behind him, and blood running over his face. Painful as was the thought of leaving him thus, it afforded her relief. She assured herself he had not been badly hurt, would recover consciousness before long, and, even bound as he was, could make his way back to the settlement. Her own situation, now that she knew Mordaunt had instigated the abduction, did not seem hopeless. Although dreading Brandt with unspeakable horror, she did not in the least fear the Englishman. He was mad to carry her off like this into the wilderness, but would force her to do nothing. He could not keep her prisoner long while Jonathan Zane and Wetzel were free to take his trail. What were his intentions? Where was he taking her? Such questions as these, however, troubled Helen more than a little. They brought her thoughts back to the Indians leading the way with lithe and stealthy step. How had Mordaunt associated himself with these savages? Then suddenly it dawned upon her that Brandt also might be in this scheme to carry her off. She scouted the idea, but it returned. Perhaps Mordaunt was only a tool. Perhaps he himself was being deceived. Helen turned pale at the very thought. She had never forgotten the strange, unreadable, yet threatening expression which Brandt had worn the day she had refused to walk with him. Meanwhile the party made rapid progress through the forest. Not a word was spoken, nor did any noise of rustling leaves or crackling twigs follow their footsteps. The savage in the lead chose the open and less difficult ground. He took advantage of glades, mossy places, and rocky ridges. This careful choosing was evidently to avoid noise, and make the trail as difficult to follow as possible. Once he stopped suddenly and listened. Helen had a good look at the savage while he was in this position. His lean, athletic figure resembled, in its half-clothed condition, a bronze statue. His powerful visage was set, changeless like iron. His dark eyes seemed to take in all points of the forest before him. Whatever had caused the halt was an enigma to all save his red-skinned companion. The silence of the wood was the silence of the desert. No bird chirped, no breath of wind sighed in the tree-tops. Even the aspens remained unagitated. Pale yellow leaves sailed slowly, reluctantly down from above. But some faint sound, something unusual, had jarred upon the exquisitely sensitive ears of the leader, for with a meaning shake of the head to his followers, he resumed the march in a direction at right angles with the original course. This caution and evident distrust of the forest ahead made Helen think again of Jonathan and Wetzel. Those great bordermen might already be on the trail of her captors. The thought thrilled her. Presently she realized, from another long, silent march through the forest thickets, glades, aisles, and groves, over rock-strewn ridges and down mossy, stoned ravines, that her strength was beginning to fail. "I can go no further with my arms tied this way," she declared, stopping suddenly. "Ugh!" uttered the savage before her, turning sharply. He brandished a tomahawk before her eyes. Mordaunt hurriedly set free her wrists. His pale face flushed a dark, flaming red when she shrank from his touch as he were a viper. After they had traveled what seemed to Helen many miles, the vigilance of the leaders relaxed. On the banks of the willow-skirted stream the Indian guide halted them, and proceeded on alone to disappear in a green thicket. Presently he reappeared, and motioned for them to come on. He led the way over smooth, sandy paths between clumps of willows, into a heavy growth of alder bushes and prickly thorns, at length to emerge upon a beautiful, grassy plot enclosed by green and yellow shrubbery. Above the stream, which cut the edge of the glade, rose a sloping, wooded ridge, with huge rocks projecting here and there out of the brown forest. Several birch-bark huts could be seen, then two rough, bearded men lolling upon the grass, and beyond them a group of painted Indians. A whoop so shrill, so savage, so exultant, that it seemingly froze her blood, rent the silence. A man, unseen before, came crashing through the willows on the side of the ridge. He leaped the stream with the spring of a wild horse. He was big and broad, with disheveled hair, keen, hard face, and wild, gray eyes. Helen's sight almost failed her. Her head whirled dizzily. It was as if her heart had stopped beating and was become a cold, dead weight. She recognized in this man the one whom she feared most of all, Brandt. He cast one glance full at her, the same threatening, cool, and evil-meaning look she remembered so well, and then engaged the Indian guide in low conversation. Helen sank at the foot of a tree, leaning against it. Despite her weariness, she had maintained some spirit, until this direful revelation broke her courage. What worse could have happened? Mordaunt had led her, for some reason that she could not divine, into the clutches of Brandt, into the power of Legget and his outlaws. But Helen was not one to remain long dispirited or hopeless. As this plot thickened, as every added misfortune weighed upon her, when just ready to give up to despair, she remembered the bordermen. Then Colonel Zane's tales of their fearless, implacable pursuit when bent on rescue or revenge recurred to her, and fortitude returned. While she had life, she would hope. The advent of the party with their prisoner enlivened Legget's gang. A great giant of a man, blond-bearded and handsome in a wild, rugged, uncouth way, a man Helen instinctively knew to be Legget, slapped Brandt on the shoulder. "Damn, Roach, if she ain't a regular little daisy. Never seed such a purty lass in my life." Brandt spoke hurriedly, and Legget laughed. All this time Case had been sitting on the grass, saying nothing, but with his little eyes watchful. Mordaunt stood near him, his head bowed, his face gloomy. "Say, Captain, I don't like this mess," whispered Case to his master. "They ain't no crew for us. I know men, for I've sailed the seas, and you're gonna get what Metz calls the double cross." Mordaunt seemed to arouse from his gloomy reverie. He looked at Brandt and Legget, who were now in earnest council. Then his eyes wandered toward Helen. She beckoned him to come to her. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked. Brandt understood my case. He planned this thing, and seemed to be a good friend of mine. He said if I once got you out of the settlement, he would give me protection until I crossed the border into Canada. There we could be married," replied Mordaunt unsteadily. "Then you meant marriage by me if I could be made to consent." "Of course. I'm not utterly vile," he replied, with face lowered in shame. "Have you any idea what you've done?" "Done? I don't understand." "You have ruined yourself, lost your manhood, become an outlaw, a fugitive, made yourself the worst thing on the border, a girl thief, and all for nothing." "No, I have you. You are more to me than all." "But can't you see? You've brought me out here for Brandt." "My God!" exclaimed Mordaunt. He rose slowly to his feet and gazed around like a man suddenly awakened from a dream. "I see it all now. Miserable, drunken wretch that I am!" Helen saw his face change and lighten as if a cloud of darkness had passed away from it. She understood that love of liquor had made him a party to this plot. Brandt had cunningly worked upon his weakness, proposed a daring scheme, and filled his befogged mind with hopes that, in a moment of clear-sightedness, he would have seen to be vain and impossible. And Helen understood also that the sudden shock of surprise, pain, possible fury, had sobered Mordaunt, possibly for the first time in weeks. The Englishman's face became exceedingly pale. Seating himself on a stone near Case, he bowed his head, remaining silent and motionless. The conference between Legget and Brandt lasted for some time. When it ended, the latter strode toward the motionless figure on the rock. "Mordaunt, you and Case will do well to follow this Indian at once to the river, where you can strike for Fort Pitt trail," said Brandt. He spoke arrogantly and authoritatively. His keen, hard face, his steely eyes bespoke the iron will and purpose of the man. Mordaunt rose with cold dignity. If he had been a dupe, he was one no longer, as could be plainly read in his calm, pale face. The old listless unsteadiness had vanished. He wore a manner of extreme quietude, but his eyes were like balls of blazing blue steel. "Mr. Brandt, I seem to have done you a service, and I am no longer required," he said in a courteous tone. Brandt eyed this man, but judged him wrongly. An English gentleman was new to the border outlaw. "I swore the girl should be mine," he hissed. "Doomed men cannot be choosers," cried Helen, who had heard him. Her dark eyes burned with scorn and hatred. All the party heard her passionate outburst. Case arose as if unconcernedly, and stood by the side of his master. Legget and the other two outlaws came up. The Indians turned their swarthy faces. "Ah, ain't she sassy?" cried Legget. Brandt looked at Helen, understood the meaning of her words, and laughed, but his face paled, and involuntarily his shifty glance sought the rocks and trees upon the ridge. "You played me from the first?" asked Mordaunt quietly. "I did," replied Brandt. "You meant nothing of your promise to help me across the border?" "No." "You intended for me to shift for myself out here in the wilderness?" "Yes, after this Indian guides you to the river trail," said Brandt, indicating with his finger the nearest savage. "I get what you frontiermen call a double-cross?" "That's it," replied Brandt with a hard laugh, in which Legget joined. A short pause ensued. "What will you do with the girl?" "That's my affair." "Marry her?" Mordaunt's voice was low and quiet. "No," cried Brandt. "She flaunted my love in my face, scorned me. She saw that borderman strike me, and by God, I'll get even. I'll keep her here in the woods until I'm tired of her, and when her beauty fades I'll turn her over to Legget." Scarcely had the words dropped from his vile lips when Mordaunt moved with tigerish agility. He seized a knife from the belt of one of the Indians. "Die!" he screamed. Brandt grasped his tomahawk. At the same instant the man who had acted as Mordaunt's guide grasped the Englishman from behind. Brandt struck ineffectively at the struggling man. "Fair play!" roared Case, leaping at Mordaunt's second assailant. His long knife sheathed its glittering length in the man's breast. Without even a groan he dropped. "Clear the decks!" Case yelled, sweeping round in a circle. All fell back before that whirling knife. Several of the Indians started as if to raise their rifles, but Legget's stern command caused them to desist. The Englishman and the outlaw now engaged in a fearful encounter. The practiced, rugged frontier desperado apparently had found his match in this pale-faced, slender man. His border skill with the hatchet seemed offset by Mordaunt's terrible rage. Brandt whirled and swung the weapon as he leaped around his antagonist. With his left arm the Englishman sought only to protect his head, while with his right he brandished the knife. Whirling here and there, they struggled across the cleared space, plunging out of sight among the willows. During a moment there was a sound as of breaking branches, then a dull blow, horrible to hear, followed by a low moan, and then deep silence. End of chapter 17. Of The Last Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Last Trail by Zane Grey, Chapter 18. A black weight was seemingly lifted from Helen's weary eyelids. The sun shone, the golden forest surrounded her. The brook babbled merrily. But where were the struggling, panting men? She noticed presently, when her vision had grown more clear, that the scene differed entirely from the willow glade where she had closed her eyes upon the fight. Then came the knowledge that she had fainted, and, during the time of unconsciousness, been moved. She lay upon a mossy mound a few feet higher than a swiftly running brook. A magnificent chestnut tree spread its leafy branches above her. Directly opposite, about 100 feet away, loomed a gray, ragged, moss-stained cliff. She noted this particularly because the dense forest encroaching to its very edge excited her admiration. Such wonderful coloring seemed unreal. Dead gold and bright red foliage flamed everywhere. 2 Indians stood nearby, silent, immovable. No other of Legget's band was visible. Helen watched the red men. Sinewy, muscular warriors they were, with bodies partially painted and long, straight hair, black as burnt wood, interwoven with bits of white bone and plaited around waving eagle plumes. At first glance their dark faces and dark eyes were expressive of craft, cunning, cruelty, courage, all attributes of the savage. Yet wild as these savages appeared, Helen did not fear them as she did the outlaws. Brandt's eyes, and Legget's too, when turned on her, emitted a flame that seemed to scorch and shrivel her soul. When the savages met her gaze, which was but seldom, she imagined she saw intelligence, even pity, in their dusky eyes. Certain it was she did not shrink from them as from Brandt. Suddenly, with a sensation of relief and joy, she remembered Mordaunt's terrible onslaught upon Brandt. Although she could not recollect the termination of that furious struggle, she did recall Brandt's scream of mortal agony, and the death of the other at Case's hands. This meant, whether Brandt was dead or not, that the fighting strength of her captors had been diminished. Surely, as the sun had risen that morning, Helen believed Jonathan and Wetzel lurked on the trail of these renegades. She prayed that her courage, hope, strength might be continued. "Ugh!" exclaimed one of the savages, pointing across the open space. A slight swaying of the bushes told that some living thing was moving among them, and an instant later the huge frame of the leader came into view. The other outlaw and Case followed closely. Further down the margin of the thicket the Indians appeared, but without the slightest noise or disturbance of the shrubbery. It required but a glance to show Helen that Case was in high spirits. His repulsive face glowed with satisfaction. He carried a bundle which Helen saw, with a sickening sense of horror, was made up of Mordaunt's clothing. Brandt had killed the Englishman. Legget also had a package under his arm, which he threw down when he reached the chestnut tree, to draw from his pocket a long leather belt, such as travelers use for the carrying of valuables. It was evidently heavy, and the musical clink which accompanied his motion proclaimed the contents to be gold. Brandt appeared next. He was white and held his hand to his breast. There were dark stains on his hunting coat, which he removed to expose a shirt blotched with red. "You ain't much hurt, I reckon?" inquired Legget solicitously. "No, but I'm bleedin' bad," replied Brandt coolly. He then called an Indian and went among the willows skirting the stream. "So I'm to be in this border crew?" asked Case, looking up at Legget. "Sure," replied the big outlaw. "You're a handy feller, Case, and after I break you into border ways, you will fit in here tip-top. Now, you'd better stick by me. When Eb Zane, his brother Jack, and Wetzel find out this here day's work, hell will be a cool place compared with their whereabouts. You'll be safe with me, and this is the only place on the border, I reckon, where you can say your life is your own." "I'm your mate, Captain. I've sailed with soldiers, pirates, sailors, and I guess I can navigate this borderland. Do we mess here? You didn't come far." "Well, I ain't particular, but I don't like eatin' with buzzards," said Legget with a grin. "That's why we moved a bit." "What's buzzards?" "Oh, maybe you'll have 'em closer'n you'd like some day, if you'd only know it. Buzzards are fine birds, most particular birds as won't eat nothin' but flesh, and white man or Injun is pie for 'em." "Captain, I've seed birds as wouldn't wait till a man was dead," said Case. "Ho, can't come no sailor yarns on this feller. Well, now we've got the Englishman's gold, one or t'other of us might just as well have it all." "Right you are, Captain. Dice, cards, anyways, so long as I knows the game." "Here, Jink, hand over your clickers and bring us a flat stone," said Legget, sitting on the moss and emptying the belt in front of him. Case took a small bag from the dark blue jacket that had so lately covered Mordaunt's shoulders, and poured out its bright contents. "This coat ain't worth keepin'," he said, holding it up. The garment was rent and slashed, and under the left sleeve was a small blood-stained hole where one of Brandt's blows had fallen. "Hello, what's this?" muttered the sailor, feeling in the pocket of the jacket. "Blast my timbers! Hooray!" He held up a small, silver-mounted whiskey flask, unscrewed the lid, and lifted the vessel to his mouth. "I'm kinder thirsty myself," suggested Legget. "Captain, a nip and no more," Case replied, holding the flask to Legget's lips. The outlaw called Jenks now returned with a flat stone, which he placed between the two men. The Indians gathered around. With greedy eyes they bent their heads over the gamblers, and watched every movement with breathless interest. At each click of the dice or clink of gold they uttered deep exclamations. "Looks agin you, captain," said Case, skillfully shaking the ivory cubes. "Ain't I got eyes?" growled the outlaw. Steadily his pile of gold diminished, and darker grew his face. "Captain, I'm a bad wind to draw," Case rejoined, drinking again from the flask. His naturally red face had become livid, his skin moist, and his eyes wild with excitement. "Hello, if them dice wasn't Jenks, and I hadn't played a four with them, I'd swear they's loaded." "You ain't insinuatin' nothin', captain?" inquired Case softly, hesitating with the dice in his hand, his evil eyes glinting at Legget. "No, you're fair enough," growled the leader. "My tough luck." The game progressed with infrequent runs of fortune for the outlaw, and presently every piece of gold lay in a shining heap before the sailor. "Clean busted!" exclaimed Legget in disgust. "Can't you find nothin' more?" asked Case. The outlaw's bold eyes wandered here and there until they rested upon the prisoner. "I'll play their lass against your pile of gold," he growled. "Best two throws out of 3. See here, she's as much mine as Brant's. You can have my pile, and I'll go you." "Nary time. Better give me back what you're win," replied Legget gruffly. "She's a trim little craft, no mistake," said Case, critically surveying Helen. "All right, captain. I'm sportin' blood, and I'll bet your throw first." Legget won the first cast, and Case with second. With deliberation the outlaw shook the dice in his huge fist and rattled them out upon the stone. "Oh!" he cried in delight. He had come within one of the highest score possible. Case nonchalantly flipped the little white blocks. The Indians crowded forward, their dusky eyes shining. Legget swore in a terrible voice which re-echoed from the stony cliff. The sailor was victorious. The outlaw got up, kicked the stone and dice in the brook, and walked away from the group. He strode to and fro under one of the trees. Gruffly he gave an order to the Indians. Several of them began at once to kindle a fire. Presently he called Jenks, who was fishing the dice out of the brook, and began to converse earnestly with him, making fierce gestures and casting lowering glances at the sailor. Case was too drunk now to see that he had incurred the enmity of the outlaw leader. He drank the last of the rum and tossed the silver flask to an Indian, who received the present with every show of delight. Case then, with the slow, uncertain movements of a man whose mind is befogged, began to count his gold, but only to gather up a few pieces when they slipped out of his trembling hands to roll on the moss. Laboriously, seriously, he kept at it with the doggedness of a drunken man. Apparently he had forgotten the others. Failing to learn the value of the coins by taking up each in turn, he arranged them in several piles, and began to estimate his wealth in sections. In the meanwhile, Helen, who had not failed to take in the slightest detail of what was going on, saw that a plot was hatching which boded ill to the sailor. Moreover, she heard Legget and Jenks whispering. "I can take him from right here atwixt his eyes," said Jenks softly, and tapped his rifle significantly. "Well, go ahead, only I'd ruther have it done quieter," answered Legget. "We're yet a long ways, near 30 miles from my camp, and there's no tellin' who's in their woods. But we've got to get rid of their fresh sailor, and there's no surer way." Cautiously cocking his rifle, Jenks deliberately raised it to his shoulder. One of the Indian sentinels, who stood near at hand, sprang forward and struck up the weapon. He spoke a single word to Legget, pointed to the woods above the cliff, and then resumed his statue-like attitude. "I told yer, Jenks, that wouldn't do it. The redskins scent somethin' in the woods, and there's an Injun I never seed fooled. We mustn't make a noise. Take your knife and tomahawk, crawl down below the edge of the bank, and slip up on him. I'll give half their gold for the job." Jenks buckled his belt more tightly, gave one threatening glance at the sailor, and slipped over the bank. The bed of the brook lay about 6 feet below the level of the ground. This afforded an opportunity for the outlaw to get behind Case without being observed. A moment passed. Jenks disappeared round a bend in the stream. Presently his grizzled head appeared above the bank. He was immediately behind the sailor, but still some 30 feet away. This ground must be covered quickly and noiselessly. The outlaw began to crawl. In his right hand he grasped a tomahawk, and between his teeth was a long knife. He looked like a huge yellow bear. The savages, with the exception of the sentinel, who seemed absorbed in the dense thicket on the cliff, sat with their knees between their hands, watching the impending tragedy. Nothing but the merest chance or some extraordinary intervention could avert Case's doom. He was gloating over his gold. The creeping outlaw made no more noise than a snake. Nearer and nearer he came, his sweaty face shining in the sun, his eyes tigerish, his long body slipping silently over the grass. At length he was within 5 feet of the sailor. His knotty hands were dug into the sward as he gathered energy for a sudden spring. At that very moment Case, with his hand on his knife, rose quickly and turned around. The outlaw, discovered in the act of leaping, had no alternative, and spring he did, like a panther. The little sailor stepped out of line with remarkable quickness, and as the yellow body whirled past him, his knife flashed blue bright in the sunshine. Jenks fell forward, his knife buried in the grass beneath him, and his outstretched hand still holding the tomahawk. Trying to double-cross me for my gold," muttered the sailor, sheathing his weapon. He never looked to see whether or no his blow had been fatal. "These border fellers might think a man as sails the seas can't handle a knife." He calmly began gathering up his gold, evidently indifferent to further attack. Helen saw Liggett raise his own rifle, but only to have it struck aside as had Jenks. This time the savage whispered earnestly to Liggett, who called the other Indians around him. The sentinel's low, throaty tones mingled with the soft babbling of the stream. No sooner had he ceased speaking than the effect of his words showed how serious had been the information, warning, or advice. The Indians cast furtive glances towards the woods. 2 of them melted like shadows into the red and gold thicket. Another stealthily slipped from tree to tree until he reached the open ground, then dropped into the grass, and was seen no more until his dark body rose under the cliff. He stole along the green-stained wall, climbed a rugged corner, and vanished amid the dense foliage. Helen felt that she was almost past discernment or thought. The events of the day, succeeding one another so swiftly and fraught with panic, had, despite her hope and fortitude, reduced her to a helpless condition of piteous fear. She understood that the savages scented danger, or had, in their mysterious way, received intelligence such as rendered them wary and watchful. "Come on now, and make no noise," said Liggett to Case. "Bring the girl, and see that she steps light." "Aye, captain," replied the sailor. "Where's Brandt?" "He'll be comin' soon's his cut stops bleedin'. I reckon he's weak yet." Case gathered up his goods, and, tucking it under his arm, grasped Helen's arm. She was leaning against a tree, and when he pulled her, she wrenched herself free, raising with difficulty. His disgusting touch and revolting face had revived her sensibilities. "You can begin duty by carrying that," said Case, thrusting the package into Helen's arms. She let it drop without moving a hand. "I'm running this ship. You belong to me," hissed Case, and then he struck her on the head. Helen uttered a low cry of distress and half staggered against a tree. The sailor picked up the package. This time she took it, trembling with horror. "That's right. Now give her Captain a kiss," he leered, and jostled against her. Helen pushed him violently. With agonized eyes she appealed to the Indians. They were engaged tying up their packs. Liggett looked on with a lazy grin. "Uh-oh," breathed Helen as Case seized her again. She tried to scream, but could not make a sound. The evil eyes, the beastly face, transfixed her with terror. Case struck her twice, then roughly pulled her toward him. Half fainting, unable to move, Helen gazed at the heated, bloated face approaching hers. When his coarse lips were within a few inches of her lips, something hot hissed across her brow. Following so closely as to be an accompaniment, rang out with singular clearness the sharp crack of a rifle. Case's face changed. The hot, surging flush faded. The expression became shaded, dulled into vacant emptiness. His eyes rolled wildly, then remained fixed, with a look of dark surprise. He stood upright an instant, swayed with the regular poise of a falling oak, and then plunged backward to the ground. His face, ghastly and livid, took on the awful calm of death. A very small hole, reddish blue round the edges, dotted the center of his temple. Legget stared aghast at the dead sailor. Then he possessed himself of the bag of gold. "Save me their trouble," he muttered, giving Case a kick. The Indians glanced at the little figure, then out into the flaming thickets. Each savage sprang behind a tree with incredible quickness. Legget saw this, and grasping Helen, he quickly led her within cover of the chestnut. Brandt appeared with his Indian companion, and both leaped to shelter behind a clump of birches near where Legget stood. Brandt's hawk eyes flashed upon the dead Jenks and Case. Without asking a question, he seemed to take in the situation. He stepped over and grasped Helen by the arm. "Who killed Case?" he asked in a whisper, staring at the little blue hole in the sailor's temple. No one answered. The two Indians who had gone into the woods to the right of the stream now returned. Hardly were they under the trees with their party, when the savage who had gone off alone arose out of the grass in the left of the brook, took it with a flying leap, and darted into their midst. He was the sentinel who had knocked up the weapons, thereby saving Case's life twice. He was lithe and supple, but not young. His grave, shadowy-lined, iron visage showed the traces of time and experience. All gazed at him at once, whose wisdom was greater than theirs. "Old horse," said Brandt in English. "Haven't I seen bullet holes like this?" The Chippewa bent over Case, and then slowly straightened his tall form. "Deathwind," he replied, answering in the white man's language. His Indian companions uttered low, plaintive murmurs, not signifying fear so much as respect. Brandt turned as pale as the clean birch bark on the tree near him. The gray flare of his eyes gave out a terrible light of certainty and terror. "Legget, you needn't try to hide your trail," he hissed, and it seemed as if there was a bitter, reckless pleasure in these words. Then the Chippewa glided into the low bushes bordering the creek. Legget followed him, with Brandt leading Helen, and the other Indians brought up the rear, each one sending wild, savage glances into the dark, surrounding forest. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Last Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Last Trail by Zane Grey, Chapter 19. A dense white fog rose from the river, obscuring all objects. When the bordermen rolled out of their snug bed of leaves, the air was cool and bracing, faintly fragrant with drying foliage and the damp, dewy luxuriance of the ripened season. Wetzel pulled from under the protecting ledge a bundle of bark and sticks he had put there to keep dry, and built the fire, while Jonathan, fashioning a cup from a green fruit resembling a gourd, filling it at a spring near by. "Lew, there's a frosty nip in the water this morning," said Jonathan. "I reckon. It's gettin' along into fall now. Ain't it clear?" Still night'll fetch all the leaves and strip the trees bare as burned timber," answered Wetzel, brushing the ashes off the strip of meat he had roasted. "Get a stick and help me cook the rest of this chunk of bison. The sun'll be an hour breaking up that mist, and we can't clear out till then. Maybe we won't have no chance to light another fire soon." With these bordermen, everything pertaining to their lonely lives, from the lighting of a fire to the trailing of a redskin, was singularly serious. No gladsome song ever came from their lips. There was no jollity around their campfire. Hunters had their moments of rapturous delight. Bordermen knew the peace, the content of the wilderness, but their pursuits racked nerve and heart. Wetzel had his moments of frenzied joy, but they passed with the echo of his vengeful yell. Jonathan's happiness, such as it was, had been to roam the forests. That before a woman's eyes had dispelled it, had been enough, and compensated him for the gloomy, bloody phantoms which haunted him. The bordermen, having partaken of the frugal breakfast, stowed in their spacious pockets all the meat that was left, and were ready for the day's march. They sat silent for a time, waiting for the mist to lift. It broke in places, rolled in huge billows, sailed aloft like great white clouds, and again hung tenaciously to the river and the plain. Away in the west, blue patches of sky shone through the rifts, and eastward banks of misty vapor reddened beneath the rising sun. Suddenly, from beneath the silver edge of the rising pall, the sun burst, gleaming gold, disclosing the winding valley with its steaming river. "We'll make upstream for 2 islands, and cross there if so be we've reason," Wetzel had said. Through the dewy dells, avoiding the wet grass and bushes, along the dark, damp glades with their yellow carpets, under the thinning arches of the trees, down the gentle slopes of the ridges, rich with green moss, the bordermen glided like gray shadows. The forest was yet asleep. A squirrel frisked up an oak and barked quarrelsomely at these strange, noiseless visitors. A crow cawed from somewhere overhead. These were the only sounds disturbing the quiet early hour. As the bordermen advanced, the woods lightened and awoke to life and joy. Birds sang, trilled, warbled, or whistled, their plaintive songs peculiar to the dying season and in harmony with the glory of the earth. Birds that in earlier seasons would have screeched and fought now sang and fluttered side by side in fraternal parade on their slow pilgrimage to the far south. "Bad time for us when the birds are so tame and chipper. We can't put faith in them these days," says Wetzel. "Seems like they never was wild. I can tell, 'cept at this season, by the way they whistle and act in the woods. If there's been any Injuns along the trails." The greater part of the morning passed thus, with the bordermen steadily traversing the forest, here through a spare and gloomy wood blasted by fire, worn by age, with many a dethroned monarch of bygone times rotting to punk and duff under the ferns, with many a dark seamed and ragged king still standing, but gray and bald of head and almost ready to take its place in the forest of the past. There, through a maze of young saplings, where each ash, maple, hickory, and oak added some new beautiful hue to the riot of color. "I just had a glimpse of the lower island as we passed an opening in the thicket," said Jonathan. "We ain't far away," replied Wetzel. The bordermen walked less rapidly in order to proceed with more watchfulness. Every rod or two they stopped to listen. "You think Legget's across the river?" asked Jonathan. "He was 2 days back and had his gang with him. He's up to some bad work, but I can't make out what. One thing, I never seen his trail so near Fort Henry." They emerged at length into a more open forest which skirted the river. At a point still some distance ahead, but plainly in sight, 2 small islands rose out of the water. "Hist! What's that?" whispered Wetzel, slipping his hand in Jonathan's arm. 100 yards beyond lay a long, dark figure stretched at full length under one of the trees close to the bank. "Looks like a man," said Jonathan. "You've hit the mark. Take a good peep round now, Jack, for we're comin' somewhere near the trail we want." Minutes passed while the patient bordermen searched the forest with their eyes, seeking out every tree within rifle range, or surveyed the level glades, scrutinized the hollows, and bent piercing eyes upon the patches of ferns. "If there's a redskin around, he ain't big enough to hold a gun," said Wetzel, moving forward again, yet still with that same stealthy step and keen caution. Finally they were gazing down upon the object which had attracted Wetzel's attention. "Will Sheppard!" cried Jonathan. "Is he dead?" "What's this mean?" Wetzel leaned over the prostrate lad, and then quickly turned to his companion. "Get some water. Take his cap. No, he ain't even hurt bad, unless he's got some wound as don't show." Jonathan returned with the water, and Wetzel bathed the bloody face. When the gash on Will's forehead was clean, it told the borderman much. "Not an hour old, that blow," muttered Wetzel. "He's comin' to," said Jonathan, as the lad stirred uneasily and moaned. Presently the lad opened his eyes and sat bolt upright. He looked bewildered for a moment, and felt of his head while gazing vaguely at the borderman. Suddenly he cried, "I remember. We were captured, brought here, and I was struck down by that villain Case." "We? Who was with you?" asked Jonathan slowly. "Helen. We came after flowers and leaves. While in full sight of the fort I saw an Indian. We hurried back," he cried, and proceeded with broken, panting voice to tell his story. Jonathan Zane leaped to his feet with face deadly white and eyes blue black like burning stars. "Jack, study the trail while I get the lad across the river," and steered for home, said Wetzel, and then he asked Will if he could swim. "Yes, but you will find a canoe there in those willows. Come, lad, we've no time to spare," added Wetzel, sliding down the bank and entering the willows. He came out almost immediately with the canoe, which he launched. Will turned that he might make a parting appeal to Jonathan to save Helen, but could not speak. The expression on the borderman's face frightened him. Motionless and erect, Jonathan stood, his arms folded and his white, stern face distorted with the agony of remorse, fear, and anguish, which, even as Will gazed, froze into an awful, deadly look of fateful purpose. Wetzel pushed the canoe off and paddled with powerful strokes. He left Will on the opposite bank and returned as swiftly as he could propel the light craft. The bordermen met each other's glance and had little need of words. Wetzel's great shoulders began to sag slightly, and his head lowered as his eyes sought the grass. A dark and gloomy shade overcast his features. Thus he passed from borderman to Deathwind. The saw of the wind overhead among the almost naked branches might well have warned Indians and renegades that Deathwind was on the trail. "Brandt's had a hand in this, and the Englishman's a fool," says Wetzel. "An hour ahead, can we come up with them before they join Brandt and Leggett?" "We can try, but like as not we'll fail. Leggett's gang is 13 strong by now." "I said it. Something told me a long trail, a hard trail, and our last trail. It's over 30 miles to Leggett's camp. We know the woods and every stream and every cover," hissed Jonathan Zane. With no further words, Wetzel took the trail on the run, and so plain was it to his keen eyes that he did not relax his steady lope except to stop and listen at regular intervals. Jonathan followed with easy swing. Through the forest and meadow, over hill and valley, they ran fleet and tireless. Once, with unerring instinct, they abruptly left the broad trail and cut far across a wide, rugged ridge to come upon the tracks of the marching band. Then, in open country, they reduced their speed to a walk. Ahead, in a narrow valley, rose a thicket of willows, yellow in the sunlight and impenetrable to human vision. Like huge snakes, the bordermen crept into this cope, over the sand, until the low branches, hard on the trail, finally in a light, open space, where the sun shone through the network of yellow branches and foliage. Wetzel's hand was laid upon Jonathan's shoulder. "Listen, hear that," he whispered.
Jonathan heard the flapping of wings and a low hissing sound not unlike that made by a goose. "Buzzards," he said, with a dark, grim smile. "Maybe Brandt has begun our work. Come." Out into the open they crawled to put to flight a flock of huge black birds with grisly, naked necks, hooked beaks, and long, yellow claws. Upon the green grass lay 3 half-naked men, ghastly, bloody, in terrible limp and lifeless positions. Metzar's man Smith, Jenks the outlaw, and Mordaunt. Jonathan Zane gazed darkly into the steely, sightless eyes of the traitor. Death's awful calm had set the expression, but the man's whole life was there, its better parts sadly shining forth among the cruel shadows. His body was mutilated in a frightful manner. Cuts, stabs, and slashes told the tale of a long encounter, brought to an end by one clean stroke. "Come here, Lou. You've seen men chopped up, but look at this dead Englishman," called Zane. Mordaunt lay weltering in a crimson tide. Strangely, though, his face was uninjured. A black bruise showed under his fair hair. The ghost of a smile seemed to hover around his set lips. Yet, almost intangible though it was, it showed that at last he had died a man. His left shoulder, side, and arm, showed where the brunt of Brandt's attack had fallen. "How'd he ever fight so?" mused Jonathan. "You never can tell," replied Wetzel. "Maybe he killed this other feller, too, but I reckon not. Come, we must go slow now, for Legget is near at hand." Jonathan brought huge, flat stones from the brook and laid them over Mordaunt. Then, cautiously, he left the glade on Wetzel's trail. 500 yards further on, Wetzel had ceased following the outlaw's tracks to cross the creek and climb a ridge. He was beginning his favorite trick of making a wide detour. Jonathan hurried forward, feeling he was safe from observation. Soon he distinguished the tall, brown figure of his comrade gliding ahead from tree to tree, from bush to bush. "See them maples and chestnuts down there?" said Wetzel, when Jonathan had come up, pointing through an opening in the foliage. "They've stopped for some reason." On through the forest the bordermen glided. They kept near the summit on the ridge, under the best cover they could find, and passed swiftly over the half circle. Then, beginning once more to draw toward the open grove in the valley, they saw a long, irregular cliff, densely wooded. They swerved a little and made for this excellent covert. They crawled the last 100 yards and never shook a fern, moved a leaf, or broke a twig. Having reached the brink of the low precipice, they saw the grassy meadow below, the straggling trees, the brook, the group of Indians crowding around the white men. "See that point of rock there? That's better cover," whispered Wetzel. Patiently, with no hurry or excitement, they slowly made their difficult way among the rocks and ferns to the vantage point desired. Taking a position like this one, the bordermen strongly favored. They could see everywhere in front, and had the thick woods at their back. "What are they up to?" whispered Jonathan, as he and Wetzel lay close together under a massive grapevine, still tenacious of its broad leaves. "Dicin'," answered Wetzel. "I can see 'em throw. Anyways, nothin' but bettin' ever makes redskins act like that." "Who's playin'? Where's Brandt?" "I can make out Legget. See shaggy head. The other must be Case. Brandt ain't in sight. Nursin' a hurt, perhaps. See there, over under the big tree as stands dark like agin the thicket? That's an Injun, and he looks too quiet and keen to suit me. We'll have a care of him. Must be playin' for Mordaunt's gold. Like as not, for where'd them ruffians get any 'cept they stole it? They're gettin' up. See Legget walk away, shaking his big head. He's mad. Maybe he'll be madder presently," growled Jonathan. "Case is left alone. He's countin' his winnin's. Jack, look out for more work took off our hands. By gum, see that Injun knock up a leveled rifle? I told you. And that redskin has his suspicions. He's seen us down along their ridge. There's Helen sittin' behind the biggest tree. That Injun guard, afore he moved, kept us from seein' her." Jonathan made no answer to this, but his breath literally hissed through his clenched teeth. "There goes the other outlaw," whispered Wetzel, as if his comrade could not see. "It's all up with Case. See that sneak bendin' down the bank? Now that's a poor way. It'd better be done from the front, walkin' up natural like, instead of tryin' to cover that wide stretch. Case'll see him, hear him sure. There, he's up now, and crawlin'. He's too slow, too slow. I knew it. Case turns. Look at the outlaw spring. Did you see that little cuss whoop his knife? One more less for us to quiet. That makes 4, Jack, and maybe soon it'll be 5. "They're holdin' the council," said Jonathan. "I see 2 Injuns sneakin' off into the woods, and here comes that guard. He's a keen redskin, Jack, for we did come light through the brush. Maybe it'd be well to stop his scoutin'." "Lew, that villain Case is bullyin' Helen," cried Jonathan. "Shh!" whispered Wetzel. "See, he's pulled her to her feet. Oh, he struck her. Oh!" Jonathan leveled his rifle and would have fired, but for the iron grasp on his wrists. "If you lost your senses, it's full 200 paces and too far for your piece," said Wetzel in a whisper. "And it ain't sense to try from here. Lend me your gun. Lend me your gun." Silently Wetzel handed him the long black rifle. Jonathan raised it, but trembled so violently that the barrel wavered like a leaf in a breeze. "Take it. I can't cover him," groaned Jonathan. "This is new to me. I ain't myself. God, Lew, he struck her again. Again. He's trying to kiss her. Wetzel, if you're my friend, kill him." "Jack, it'd be better to wait and—" "I love her," breathed Jonathan. The long black barrel swept up to a level and stopped. White smoke belched from among the green leaves. The report rang throughout the forest. "Ah, I saw him stop and pause," hissed Jonathan. "He stands, he sways, he falls. Death for yours, you sailor beast." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Last Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Last Trail by Zane Grey, Chapter 20. The bordermen watched Leggett and his band disappear into the thicket adjoining the grove. When the last dark, lithe form glided out of sight among the yellowing copse, Jonathan leapt from the low cliff, and had hardly reached the ground before Wetzel dashed down to the grassy turf. Again they followed the outlaw's trail, darker-faced, fiercer visaged than ever, with cocked, tightly gripped rifles thrust well before them, and light feet that scarcely brushed the leaves. Wetzel halted after a long tramp up and down the ridges, and surveyed with keen intent the lay of the land ahead. "Sooner or later we'll hear from that redskin as discovered us a ways back," whispered he. "I wish we might get a crack at him before he hinders us bad. I ain't seen many keener Injuns. It's lucky we've fixed their arrow-shooting Shawnee. We'd never have beat that combination, and for all of that, I'm worrying some about the goin' ahead." "Ambush?" Jonathan asked. "Like as not. Leggett'll send that Injun back, and maybe more'n him. Jack, see them little footprints? They're Helen's. Look how she's draggin' along, almost tuckered out. Leggett can't travel many more miles today. He'll make a stand somewheres and lose all his redskins afore he gives up the lass. I'll never live through tonight with her in that gang. She'll be saved or dead before the stars pale in the light of the moon. I reckon we're nigh the end for some of us. It'll be moonlight in an hour after dusk, and now it's only the middle of the afternoon. We've time enough for anything. Now, Jack,
Let's not tackle the trail straight. We'll split and go round and head 'em off. See that dead white oak standin' high over there?" Jonathan looked out between the spreading branches of a beech and saw far over a low meadow, luxuriant with grasses and rushes and bright with sparkling ponds and streams, the dense wood out of which towered a bare, bleached tree top. "You slip around along the right side of this medder, and I'll take the left side. Go slow, and have your eyes open. We'll meet under that big dead tree. I allow we can see it from anywhere around. We'll leave the trail here, and take it up further on. Legget's goin' straight for his camp. He ain't losin' an inch. He wants to get in that rocky hole of his'n." Wetzel stepped off the trail, glided into the woods, and vanished. Jonathan turned to the right, traversed the summit of the ridge, softly traveled down the slope, and, after crossing a slow, eddying, quiet stream, gained the edge of the forest on that side of the swamp. A fringe of briars and prickly thorns bordered this wood, affording an excellent cover. On the right the land rose rather abruptly. He saw that by walking up a few paces he could command a view of the entire swamp, as well as the ridge beyond, which contained Wetzel, and probably the outlaw and his band. Remembering his comrade's admonition, Jonathan curbed his unusual impatience and moved slowly. The wind swayed the tree tops and rustled the fallen leaves. Birds sang as if thinking the warm, soft weather was summer come again. Squirrels dropped heavy nuts that cracked on the limbs, or fell with a thud to the ground, and they scampered over the dry earth, scratching up the leaves as they barked and scolded. Crows cawed clamorously after a hawk that had darted under the tree-tops to escape them. Deer loped swiftly up the hill, and a lordly elk rose from a wallow in a grassy swamp, crashing into the thicket. When 2/3 around his oval plain, which was a mile long and perhaps 1/4 as wide, Jonathan ascended the hill to make a survey. The grass waved bright brown and golden in the sunshine, swished in the wind, and swept like a choppy sea to the opposite ridge. The hill was not densely wooded. In many places the red-brown foliage opened upon irregular patches, some black, as if having been burned over, others showing the yellow and purple colors of the low thickets and the gray, barren stones. Suddenly Jonathan saw something darken one of those sunlit plots. Might have been a deer. He studied the rolling, rounded tree-tops, the narrow strips between the black trunks, and the open places that were clear in the sunshine. He had nearly come to believe he had seen a small animal or bird flit across the white of the sky far in the background, when he distinctly saw a dark figure stealing along past a green-gray rock, only to disappear under colored banks of foliage. Presently, lower down, they reappeared and crossed an open patch of yellow fern. Jonathan counted them. 2 were rather yellow in color, the hue of buckskin, another slight of stature as compared with the first, and light gray by contrast. Then 6 black, slender, gliding forms crossed the space. Jonathan then lost sight of them, and did not get another glimpse. He knew them to be Leggett and his band. The slight figure was Helen. Jonathan broke into a run, completed the circle around the swamp, and slowed into a walk when approaching the big, dead tree where he was to wait for Wetzel. Several rods beyond the lowland he came to a wood of white oaks, all giants, rugged and old, with scarcely a sapling intermingled with them. Although he could not see the objective point, he knew from his accurate sense of distance that he was near it. As he entered the wood he swept its whole length and width with his eyes. He darted forward 20 paces to halt suddenly behind a tree. He knew full well that a sharply moving object was more difficult to see in the woods than one stationary. Again he ran, fleet and light, a few paces ahead to take up a position as before behind a tree. Thus he traversed the forest. On the other side he found the dead oak of which Wetzel had spoken. Its trunk was hollow. Jonathan squeezed himself into the blackened space.
with his head in a favorable position behind a projecting knot, where he could see what might occur near at hand. He waited for what seemed to him a long while, during which he neither saw nor heard anything, and then suddenly the report of a rifle rang out. A single piercing scream followed. Hardly had the echo ceased when three hollow reports, distinctly different in tone from the first, could be heard from the same direction. In quick succession, short, fierce yells attended rather than succeeded the reports. Jonathan stepped out of the hiding-place, cocked his rifle, and fixed a sharp eye on the ridge before him whence those startling cries had come. The first rifle shot, unlike any other in its short, spiteful, stinging quality, was unmistakably Wetzel's. Zane had heard it, followed many times, as now, by the wild death-cry of a savage. The other reports were of Indian guns, and the yells were the clamoring, exultant cries of Indians in pursuit. Far down where the open forest met the gloom of the thickets, a brown figure flashed across the yellow ground, darting among the trees, across the glades. It moved so swiftly that Jonathan knew it was Wetzel. In another instant a chorus of yelps resounded from the foliage, and three savages burst through the thicket, almost at right angles with the fleeing borderman, running to intercept him. The borderman did not swerve from his course, but came on straight toward the dead tree, with the wonderful fleetness that so often had served him well. Even in that moment Jonathan thought of what desperate chances his comrade had taken. The trick was plain. Wetzel had most likely shot the dangerous scout, and, taking to his heels, raced past the others, trusting to his speed and their poor marksmanship to escape with a whole skin. When within 100 yards of the oak, Wetzel's strength apparently gave out. His speed deserted him. He ran awkwardly and limped. The savages burst out into full cry like a pack of hungry wolves. They had already emptied their rifles at him, and now, supposing one of the shots had taken effect, redoubled their efforts, making the forest ring with their short, savage yells. One gaunt, dark-bodied Indian with a long, powerful, springy stride easily distanced his companions, and, evidently sure of gaining the coveted scalp of the borderman, rapidly closed the gap between them as he swung aloft his tomahawk, yelling the war-cry. The sight on Jonathan's rifle had several times covered this savage's dark face, but when he was about to press the trigger, Wetzel's fleeting form, also in line with the savage, made it extremely hazardous to take a shot. Jonathan stepped from his place of concealment and let out a yell that pealed high over the cries of the savages. Wetzel suddenly dropped flat on the ground. With a whipping crack of Jonathan's rifle, the big Indian plunged forward on his face. The other Indians, not 50 yards away, stopped aghast at the fate of their comrade, and were about to seek the shelter of trees when, with his terrible yell, Wetzel sprang up and charged upon them. He had left his rifle where he fell, but his tomahawk glittered as he ran. The lameness had been a trick, for now he covered ground with a swiftness which caused his former progress to seem slow. The Indians, matured and seasoned warriors though they were, gave but one glance at his huge brown figure bearing down upon them like a fiend, and, uttering the Indian name of Deathwind, wavered, broke, and ran. One not so fleet as his companion, Wetzel overtook and cut down with a single stroke. The other gained 100 yards straight in the slight interval of Wetzel's attack, and, spurred on by a pealing, awful cry in the rear, sped swiftly in and out among the trees until he was lost to view. Wetzel scalped the two dead savages, and, after returning to regain his rifle, joined Jonathan at the dead oak.
"Jack, you can never tell how things is comin' out. That redskin I allowed might worry us a bit fooled me as slick as you ever saw, and I had to shoot him, knowin' it was a case of runnin'. I just cut for this oak, drew the redskins' fire, and had 'em after me quicker'n you'd say Jack Robinson. I was hopin' you'd be here, but wasn't sure till I seen your rifle. Then I kinder got a kink in my leg just to coax the brutes on."
"3 more quiet," said Jonathan Zane. "What now?" "We've headed Leggett, and we'll keep nosin' him off his course. Already he's lookin' for a safe campin' place for the night." "There is none in these woods for him.
We didn't plan this gettin' between him and his camp, but couldn't be better fixed. A mile further along the ridge is a camping place, with a spring and a little dell close under a big stone, and well wooded. Legget's headin' straight for it. With a couple of Injuns guardin' that spot, he'll think he's safe. But I know the place, and can crawl to that rock the darkest night that ever was, and never crack a stick."
In the gray of the deepening twilight, Jonathan Zane sat alone. An owl hooted dismally in the dark woods beyond the thicket where the borderman crouched waiting for Wetzel. His listening ear detected a soft, rustling sound like the play of a mole under the leaves. A branch trembled and swung back. A soft footstep followed, and Wetzel came into the retreat. "Well?" asked Jonathan impatiently, as Wetzel deliberately sat down and laid his rifle across his knee. "Easy, Jack, easy. We've an hour to wait. The time I've already waited has been long for me."
"They're there," said Wetzel grimly.
"How far from here?"
"A half hour's slow crawl. Close by," hissed Jonathan. "Too near for you to get excited. Let's us go. It's as light now as in the gray of morning." "Mornin' would be best. Injuns get sleepy along towards day. I've ever found that time the best. But we'll be lucky if we catch these redskins asleep." "Lew, I can't wait here all night. I won't leave her longer with that renegade. I've got to free or kill her." "Most likely it'll be the last," said Wetzel simply. "Well, so be it then," and the borderman hung his head. "You needn't worry none about Helen. I just had a good look at her not half an hour back. She's fagged out, but full of spunk yet. I seen that when Brandt went near her. Leggett got his hands full just now with the redskins. He's havin' trouble keepin' them on this slow trail. I ain't sayin' they're scared, but they're mighty restless." "Will you take the chance now?" "I reckon you needn't have asked that." "Tell me the lay of the land." "Why, if we get to this rock I spoke about, we'll be right over 'em. It's 10 feet high, and we can jump straight amongst 'em. Most likely 2 or 3'll be guardin' the openin', which is a little ways to the right. But there's a big tree, the only one low down by the spring. Helen's under it, half sittin', half leanin' against the roots. When I first looked, her hands were free, but I saw Brandt bind her feet, and he had to get an Injun to help him, for she kicked a spirited little filly. There's moss under the tree, and there's where the redskins will lay down to rest. I've got that. Now out with your plan." "Well, I calculate it's this. The moon'll be up in 'bout an hour. We'll crawl as we've never crawled before, because Helen's life depends as much on our not making a noise as it does on fightin'. When the time comes, if they hear us afore we're ready to shoot, the lass'll be tomahawked quicker'n lightnin'. If they don't suspicion us when the right moment comes, you shoot Brandt. Yell louder you ever did before. Lip amongst 'em, and cut down the first Injun that's near you on your way to Helen. Swing her over your arm and dig into the woods."
"Well?" asked Jonathan when Wetzel finished. "That's all," replied the borderman grimly.
"And leave you all alone to fight Leggett and the rest of 'em?"
"I reckon."
"Not to be thought of?"
"There's no other way."
"Well, there must be. Let me think. I'm not myself." "No other way," replied Wetzel curtly.
Jonathan's broad hand fastened on Wetzel's shoulder and wheeled him around. "Have I ever left you alone?"
"This is different." And Wetzel turned away again. His voice was cold and hard. "How is it different? We've had the same thing to do almost more than once." "We've never had a bad bunch to handle as Leggett's. They're looking for us, and we'll be hard to beat. That's no reason. We never had to save a girl one of us loved."
Jonathan was silent.
"I said this'd be my last trail," continued Wetzel. "I've felt it, and I know it'll be yours." "Why?" "If you get away with the girl, she'll keep you at home, and it'll be well. If you don't succeed, you'll die trying. So it's your last trail." Wetzel's deep, cold voice rang with truth. "Lew, I can't run away and leave you to fight these devils alone. After all these years we've been together, I can't." "No other chance to save the lass." Jonathan quivered with the force of his emotion. His black eyes glittered. His hands grasped at nothing. Once more he was between love and duty. Again he fought over the old battle, but this time it left him weak. "You love that big-eyed lass, don't you?" asked Wetzel, turning with softened face and voice. "I've gone mad," cried Jonathan, tortured by the simple question of his friend. Those big, dear, wonderful eyes he loved so well looked at him now from the gloom of the thicket. The old, beautiful, soft glow, the tender light, was there, and more, a beseeching prayer to save her. Jonathan bowed his head, ashamed to let his friend see the tears that dimmed his eyes. "Jack, we've follered the trail for years together. Always you've been true and staunch. This is our last. But whatever bides, we'll break up Legget's band tonight, and the border'll be cleared. Maybe for always. At least his race is run. Let that content you. Our time have to come sooner or later, so why not now? I know how it is, that you want to stick by me, but the lass draws you to her. I understand, and want you to save her. Maybe you never dreamed it, but I can tell you just how you feel. All the trembling and softness and sweetness and delight you got for that girl is no mystery to Lew Wetzel." "You loved a lass?" Wetzel bowed his head as perhaps he had never before in all his life. "Betty, always," he answered softly. "My sister?" exclaimed Jonathan, and then his hand closed hard on his comrade's. His mind going back to many things strange in the past, but now explained. Wetzel had revealed his secret. "And it's been all my life, since she wasn't higher'n my knee. There was a time when I might have been closer to you than I am now, but I was a mad and bloody Injun hater, so I never let her know till I seen it was too late. Well, no more of me. I only told it for you." Jonathan was silent. "And now to come back where we left off," continued Wetzel. "Let's take a more hopeful look at this comin' fight. Sure, I said it was my last trail, but maybe it's not. You can never tell. Feelin' as we do, I imagine they've no odds on us. Never in my life did I say to you, least of all to anyone else, what I was goin' to do, but I'll tell it now. If I land uninjured amongst that bunch, I'll kill them all." The giant borderman's low voice hissed and stung. His eyes glittered with unearthly fire. His face was cold and gray. He spread out his brawny arms and clenched his huge fists, making the muscles of his broad shoulders roll and bulge. "I hate the thought, Lew. I hate the thought. Ain't there no other way? No other way?" "I'll do it, Lew, because I'd do the same for you. Because I have to, because I love her, but God, it hurts." "That's right," answered Wetzel, his deep voice softening until it was singularly low and rich. "I'm glad you've come to it, and sure it hurts. I want you to feel so at leavin' me to go it alone. If we both get out alive, I'll come many times to see you and Helen. If you live and I don't, think of me sometimes. Think of the trails we've crossed together. When the fall comes with its soft, cool air and smoky mornin' and starry nights, when the wind's sad among the bare branches and the leaves drop down, remember they're fallin' on my grave." Twilight darkened into gloom. The red tinge in the west changed to opal light. Through the trees, over a dark ridge, a rim of silver glinted and moved.
The moon had risen. The hour was come. The bordermen tightened their belts, replaced their leggins, tied their hunting coats, loosened their hatchets, looked to the priming of their rifles, and were ready. Wetzel walked 20 paces and turned. His face was white in the moonlight. His dark eyes softened into a look of love as he gripped his comrade's outstretched hand. Then he dropped flat on the ground, carefully saw to the position of his rifle, and began to creep. Jonathan kept close at his heels. Slowly but steadily they crawled, minute after minute. The hazelnut bushes above them had not yet shed their leaves. The ground was clean and hard, and the course fatefully perfect for their deadly purpose. A slight rustling of their buckskin garments sounded like the rustling of leaves in a faint breeze. The moon came out above the trees, and still Wetzel advanced softly, steadily, surely. The owl, lonely sentinel of that wood, hooted dismally. Even his night eyes, which made the darkness seem clear as day, missed those gliding figures. Even he, sure guardian of the wilderness, failed the savages. Jonathan felt soft moss beneath him. He was now into the woods under the trees. The thicket had been passed. Wetzel's moccasin pressed softly against Jonathan's head. The first signal. Jonathan crawled forward and slightly raised himself. He was on a rock. The trees were thick and gloomy. Below, the little hollow was almost in the wan moonbeams. Dark figures lay close together. 2 savages paced noiselessly to and fro. A slight form, rolled in a blanket, lay against a tree. Jonathan felt his arm gently squeezed. The second signal. Slowly he thrust forward his rifle and raised it in unison with Wetzel's. Slowly he rose to his feet, as if the same muscle guided them both. Over his head a twig snapped. In the darkness he had not seen a low branch. The Indian guard stopped suddenly and became motionless as stone. They had heard, but too late. With the blended roar of the rifles, both dropped, lifeless. Almost under the spouting flame and white cloud of smoke, Jonathan leaped behind Wetzel. Over the bank his yells were mingled with Wetzel's vengeful cry. Like leaping shadows the bordermen were upon their foes. An Indian sprang up, raised a weapon, and fell beneath Jonathan's savage blow to rise no more. Over his prostrate body the borderman bounded. A dark, nimble form darted upon the captive. He swung high a blade that shone like silver in the moonlight. His shrill war cry of death rang out with Helen's scream of despair, even as he swung back her head with one hand in her long hair. His arm descended, but it fell upon the borderman's body. Jonathan and the Indian rolled upon the moss. There was a terrific struggle, a whirling blade, a dull blow, which silenced the yell, and the borderman rose alone. He lifted Helen as if she were a child, leaped the brook, and plunged into the thicket. The noise of the fearful conflict he left behind swelled high and hideously on the night air. Above the shrill cries of the Indians and the furious yells of Legget rose the mad, booming roar of Wetzel. No rifle cracked, but sodden blows, the clash of steel, the thrashing of struggling men, told of the dreadful strife. Jonathan gained the woods, sped through the moonlight glades, and far on under light and shadow. The shrill cries ceased. Only the hoarse yells and the mad roar could be heard. Gradually these all died away, and the forest was still. End of chapter 20.